I wanted to introduce our guest lecturer this morning. It is a riot and a blast to be in ministry together with all of you, and especially with Jordan. And on Tuesday and Wednesday, when I was still unable to do anything other than lay flat on my back without experiencing not so good feelings, Jordan said, "Oh, I'll preach. I said, "Well, get ready. I think I might be ready by Sunday." And then Thursday afternoon, I was seeing light at the end of the tunnel and was convinced it wasn't a train coming the other way. Was feeling better. I said, "I think I'll be right." I was like, "No, I need that." Cool, that'd be great. So we just kind of switched roles this morning. I think you'll enjoy it's kind of intimidating to let him go because, now, I'll be judged or graded, but it was a delight and a good word. And I know that you'll be listening, but I hope that we will all hear God's word coming to us through Jordan as he shares.
Well, there were a couple speakers that I listened to on the internet as well as a book written by one of those speakers. God has really been showing me some neat things about the gospel through the parable that we call the parable of Prodigal Son. So it's a pretty familiar story, but I want to look at it a little more culturally and a little more detail so that we can pick up on some of the nuances of what Jesus is trying to say. So it's in Luke chapter 15, and it's part of a trilogy of 3 parables. I'm just going to read the very intro and then the parable of the Prodigal Son. I encourage you to read it later in its entirety. It says, tax collectors and other notorious sinners often came to listen to Jesus teach. This made the Pharisees and teachers of the religious law complain that he was associating with such sinful people, even eating with them. And here's verse 11. To illustrate the point further, Jesus told them this story. A man had 2 sons. The younger son told his father, "I want my share of your estate now before you die." So his father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. A few days later, this younger son packed all his belongings and moved to a distant land, and there he wasted all his money in wild living. About the time his money ran out, a great famine struck over the land, and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and the man sent him to the fields to feed pigs. The young man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the pigs looked good to him, but no one gave him anything. When he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, "At home, even hired servants have food enough to spare, and here I am dying of hunger. I will go home to my father and say, 'Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Please take me on as a hired servant.' So he returned home to his father, and while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming. Full of love and compassion, he ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. His son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But his father said to the servants, 'Quick, bring the finest robe of the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet. And kill the calf we've been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast. For this son of mine is dead and has now returned to life. He was lost, but now he is found.' So the party began. Meanwhile, the older son was in the fields working. When he returned home, he heard music and dancing in the house. And he asked one of the servants what was going on. 'Your brother is back,' he was told. 'Your father has killed the fattened calf. We are celebrating because of his safe return.' The older brother was angry and wouldn't go in. The father came out and begged him, and he replied, 'All these years I have slaved for you, and never once refused to do a single thing you told me to do. And in that time you never gave me even one young goat for a feast with my friends. But when this son of yours comes back after squandering money on prostitutes, you celebrate by killing the fattened calf.' His father said to him, 'Look, dear son, you have always stayed by me, and everything I have is yours. We had to celebrate this happy day, for your brother was dead, and has come back to life. He was lost, but now he is found.'" We call this the parable of the lost son, or sometimes we call it the parable of the prodigal son. Prodigal means spend lavishly. We call it prodigal son because of the way he wasted his money. But to do that is very misleading, because the story is not about one son. Jesus very clearly introduces it, that there was a man who had 2 sons. And so when Jesus introduces it, he clearly states that the star of the story is the father. And there's not one son, there are 2 sons. And so in some way, we're supposed to compare these 2 sons. Now you have to understand who Jesus is speaking to really grasp what's going on in this parable, because he is making the father representative of God, and he's making 2 sons to represent the 2 people groups that he's speaking to. One is this group, and it's called the sinners and the tax collectors. Does that seem redundant to anybody else? Why do we say sinners and tax collectors? We think of sinners as, well, I'm a sinner, you're a sinner, we're all sinners. But sinners in Jesus' day was a very specific people group. They were people who were told because of something their parents did or because of something they did, that they were never allowed to go into the temple and be right with God. They were people who had dirty jobs or were deformed in some way, had some sort of disabilities. Those people were told their whole lives they were never going to be right with God because they couldn't go into the temple as sacrifice. And when we think of tax collectors, we think of a kind of a glorified used car salesman. You know, you owe the Roman $20 and he charges you $30. You have to understand that the tax collectors were despicable people at this time, not because they ripped people off, but they paid money and made money funding the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was a terrible group. They were taking over cities and destroying the Roman government, coming in and killing everyone in the city by crucifying them on the roads in and out of the town, so that when you went through that town, you remembered who was in charge. The Roman Empire was a terrible empire, and the tax collectors made money selling out their own countrymen to support those armies. And so they were never allowed in the temple. These were people that were so bad they knew they would never be right with God. And so it's to these people that Jesus represents the underdog. Also represented there are the Pharisees and the scribes and teachers of the law. And those people were always taught that they had earned special favor with God because of their goodness. It was the opposite worldview. They were the ones primarily telling the sinners they could not go to the temple. And so it's to these 2 conflicting groups Jesus tells this story. Act 1 is about the younger brother. We have to understand that when, in Jesus' time, and this is hard for us to grasp, but your property, your wealth was how you were identified. You were identified by your land. If you remember the musical Oklahoma, there's a line in the theme song that says that we belong to the lands. You are identified by your lands. And so to give the younger son his share of the inheritance, he didn't have it in a bank account. He couldn't liquidate an investment. He had to sell his land. And the word wealth, the proper that we did in English, is actually in Greek the word bios, from which we get the word biology. It literally means he has to divide himself in order to give his son what he's asking for. And a father should never have done that for a son. Because the son was entitled to inheritance, but it was when the father died. So when he's asking for his inheritance, what he's saying is, I wish you did. I want your stuff. I want your things. But I don't want you. The father should have ran him out of the house at that point. But this father, representing God, he takes that rejected love and he does that for his son. He lets him go. Breaking all kinds of cultural norms. The son goes out and spends until there's nothing left. And he ends up feeding pigs. Now, the people group Jesus is talking to is who? Jews. Okay? Feeding pigs is like the lowest of the low. I mean, Jesus is speaking a metaphor that to this audience would have been bottom of the barrel. Whenever you run away from God to do your own thing and pursue your own desires, you always end up in a pit bank. It always ends up in empty pursuits. But this son, he plots an idea in his head. He says he comes to his senses. Realizes where he's at. He comes to his senses and he hatches this plan. He said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go back and I'm going to work as a hired servant. Now, a hired servant would not have lived in the same home as the patriarch. hired servants lived in town and came to work for her father. So he's saying, I can't be part of the family, I can't be part of the household, but I know I'm going to start to earn my father's love back. I'm going to start to pay him off. I'm going to start to pay him back. So he comes to his senses and he starts coming home. And the father sees him way off. And that's an important detail. The father doesn't see his son coming and have to decide, well, am I going to be angry? How much am I going to make him work? What does he owe me again now? Plus interest. No. He sees him a long way off and he runs. Culture